Arthur Blackwood, a man sculpted by success and defined by precision, navigated the hushed corridors of his opulent penthouse apartment with a cadence as unwavering as the ticking of a Swiss timepiece. Every facet of his existence was meticulously orchestrated. His tech empire, Blackwood Innovations, flourished under his iron-fisted control, each strategic decision calculated with surgical accuracy. His home, a haven of minimalist chic, operated with the silent efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Spontaneity was anathema. Surprises were unwelcome. Life, for Arthur, was a perfectly balanced equation. That was, until he glanced through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city below. His 10-year-old daughter, Lily, was engaged in an activity so jarringly out of sync with his carefully constructed reality that he stopped dead in his tracks. She was dancing, but not alone. Standing beside her was Mrs. Rodriguez, their live-in nanny, a woman Arthur barely registered beyond her efficient execution of childcare duties. The sight was so surreal, so utterly improbable, that Arthur blinked, questioning the reliability of his own perception. Yet, the scene persisted. Lily and Mrs. Rodriguez moved in a harmonious interplay against the urban backdrop, their forms illuminated by the golden hues of the setting sun. Lily's movements were tentative, childlike, imbued with a delightful awkwardness. She stumbled, her small frame faltering, but instead of the familiar frustration he often witnessed during homework sessions, a peal of unrestrained laughter echoed across the room, a sound that resonated with a forgotten joy. Ever since her mother's untimely passing 2 years prior, Lily had retreated into a shell of quiet compliance, her vibrant spirit dimmed by grief. To see her laughing, genuinely, freely, was a shock to Arthur's heart. Mrs. Rodriguez, on the other hand, moved with an unexpected grace, a fluidity of motion that belied her position as a caregiver. Each step was deliberate, each gesture precise. This wasn't mere playful improvisation. This was the practiced execution of someone intimately familiar with the art of movement. Her guidance was gentle, nurturing, yet firm, subtly correcting Lily's form, encouraging her to explore the rhythm within. A cold wave of unease washed over Arthur. He resented the fact that someone else, an employee, a figure he deemed inconsequential, held such influence over his daughter. The longer he observed, the more his irritation spiraled. He wouldn't tolerate this. With a rigid posture, he strode across the polished marble floors and out onto the balcony, his footsteps echoing with unspoken disapproval. As he approached, Lily and Mrs. Rodriguez turned, their expressions shifting. Lily's newfound joy morphed into apprehension, a mirror of her father's usual demeanor. Mrs. Rodriguez, however, remained composed, her eyes holding a quiet strength as she calmly wiped her hands on her apron. "What is going on here?" Arthur's voice was a controlled baritone, each syllable clipped with authority. Lily lowered her gaze, her small hands fidgeting. Mrs. Rodriguez met Arthur's piercing stare without flinching. "We were practicing, Mr. Blackwood," she stated simply. "Practicing what, exactly?" Arthur directed his attention to Lily. "Since when?" The little girl hesitated, shuffling her feet. "For a while now," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. A sharp pang of guilt pierced Arthur's stoic facade. He had been so consumed by his business, so lost in his grief, that he had failed to notice his own daughter's silent yearning. He had become a stranger in his own home. "And why didn't you tell me?" Arthur's voice was laced with a subtle accusation, directed as much at himself as at Lily. Lily shrugged, a small, helpless gesture. Before she could answer, Mrs. Rodriguez intervened, her voice calm but resolute. "Because she had no one to practice with, Mr. Blackwood." Arthur's gaze narrowed, focusing on the nanny. There was an underlying challenge in her tone, a subtle defiance that pricked at his carefully constructed sense of control. "This isn't part of your job description, Mrs. Rodriguez." "No, it isn't," she agreed without hesitation. "Then why are you doing it?" Arthur's question was a demand, an assertion of his authority. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Because she asked me to." Arthur turned back to Lily, his voice softening slightly. "Is that true, Lily?" Lily nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. A heavy silence descended, thick with unspoken emotions. Arthur exhaled slowly, his irritation warring with a nascent sense of understanding. He had no logical reason to be so bothered by this seemingly innocent interaction. Yet he felt a deep-seated discomfort, a sense that something was amiss, that a hidden layer lay beneath the surface of this seemingly simple scenario. His world, built on clear definitions and predictable outcomes, was beginning to shift, destabilized by a force he couldn't quite grasp. His gaze returned to Mrs. Rodriguez. "I need to speak with you, alone." Lily looked up at them both, her brow furrowed with concern. Mrs. Rodriguez remained composed, her voice even. "As you wish, Mr. Blackwood." Arthur turned sharply and headed back into the apartment without waiting for Mrs. Rodriguez to follow. As he stepped inside, he glanced back. Lily leaned towards Mrs. Rodriguez, whispering something. Mrs. Rodriguez responded quietly, her expression unreadable. Lily's face broke into a small, conspiratorial smile. A chill ran down Arthur's spine. There was something more to this, something hidden, something he wasn't seeing. And Arthur Blackwood, a man who built an empire on uncovering hidden truths, was determined to unearth it. What secrets did Mrs. Rodriguez hold? And what was she truly teaching his daughter? Arthur sat in his expansive office, surrounded by the symbols of his success: sleek glass, cutting-edge technology, and panoramic city views. His fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on the glowing screen of his computer. The information displayed before him was both mundane and unsettling. Maria Rodriguez, 32 years old, employed as a nanny in his household for 8 months. Clean background check. No criminal record. No discernible red flags. A standard resume. Unremarkable references. By all appearances, she was exactly what she claimed to be: a responsible, reliable caregiver who performed her duties diligently and remained discreetly in the background. Yet Arthur couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to Mrs. Rodriguez than met the eye. His instincts, honed by years of navigating the treacherous waters of the business world, had rarely failed him. He had built his empire on an uncanny ability to discern hidden agendas, to detect the slightest tremor of deception. Now, those same instincts screamed that Mrs. Rodriguez was not simply a nanny. She was a mystery waiting to be unraveled. With a decisive click, he typed her name into a broader search engine, adding a keyword that had been simmering in his subconscious ever since he had witnessed her dance. Maria Rodriguez, ballet. The initial results were a frustrating mix of generic profiles and irrelevant links. He scrolled through pages of digital noise, his frustration mounting. Then, buried beneath a deluge of unrelated information, he found it. A news article from a decade ago. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes scanning the headline. Promising ballerina forced to end career after tragic accident. His pulse quickened. He clicked the link, and as the page loaded, a photograph of a younger Maria Rodriguez filled the screen. She was adorned in a pristine white tutu, poised on a grand stage, her arms lifted in perfect fifth position. Her expression was serene, confident, radiating an inner strength that was strikingly different from the reserved nanny who cared for his daughter. The article recounted the story of a rising star in the ballet world, a dancer of unparalleled talent and dedication. She had captivated audiences in prestigious theaters across the country, earning rave reviews for her technical brilliance and artistic expressiveness. She was on the cusp of international acclaim, poised to ascend to the highest echelons of the dance world. Then, tragedy struck. A devastating injury during a rehearsal shattered her dreams, leaving her unable to dance professionally. The article spoke of multiple surgeries, grueling physical therapy, and ultimately, the heartbreaking realization that her career was over. No interviews, no public appearances, just a sudden and complete disappearance from the spotlight. Arthur sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Why would someone with that kind of talent, that level of dedication, abandon their passion, their very identity? How did she end up here, caring for his daughter in his home? The questions swirled in his mind, demanding answers. He knew that he wouldn't find them by staring at a screen. He needed to hear the truth from her, to understand the motivations that drove her actions. Rising abruptly, he strode out of his office and made his way to the kitchen. Mrs. Rodriguez was there, as expected, methodically preparing dinner. She glanced up as he entered, her expression neutral but guarded. "Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him, wiping her hands on a clean towel. "Is there something you need?" Arthur bypassed the pleasantries. He pulled out his phone and placed it on the counter, the article about her ballet career prominently displayed on the screen. "Care to explain this?" For the first time since he had met her, Arthur saw a flicker of genuine surprise cross her face. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she looked at the screen, then back at him, her eyes searching. "You've been investigating me," she stated, her voice calm, but with a hint of resignation. Arthur folded his arms, his gaze unwavering. "I don't like secrets in my home, Mrs. Rodriguez." Mrs. Rodriguez exhaled slowly and placed the dish towel down. "I suppose I should have expected this," she said quietly. "You're not the type of man to let things go unanswered." Arthur remained silent, waiting for her to continue. She looked at the article again, her fingers tracing the edge of the counter. "I was a dancer," she admitted, her voice laced with a hint of melancholy. "A long time ago." "You were more than just a dancer," Arthur corrected her. "You were a star." A bitter smile touched her lips. "A star that burned out before it could truly shine." Arthur studied her carefully, trying to decipher the emotions swirling beneath her carefully constructed facade. "Why did you leave?" She hesitated, her eyes darting away. Arthur could see the internal struggle, the conflict between her desire to protect her privacy and her inherent honesty. Finally, she sighed, the sound heavy with unspoken pain. "Because I lost everything." Her voice was quieter now, more vulnerable than he had ever heard it before. Arthur didn't push, he simply waited, allowing her to find the strength to share her story. "When I was 25, dance was my entire world," she began, her voice tinged with a nostalgic sadness. "It was all I knew, all I cared about. I dedicated every waking moment to perfecting my craft, pushing myself beyond my physical and mental limits. I believed that I was destined for something great." She paused, her gaze distant, lost in a sea of memories. "And I wasn't alone." Arthur frowned, sensing the impending weight of her revelation. "Who?" "My husband," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Daniel. He was a dancer too. We had trained together since we were children, shared the same dreams, the same aspirations. We were supposed to conquer the world together." A knot tightened in Arthur's stomach. He already knew where this was heading. He could feel the approaching storm of heartbreak and loss. "We were offered a contract with the Royal Ballet," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "It was a dream come true, the culmination of years of sacrifice and unwavering dedication. We were on the verge of achieving everything we had ever wanted." Her voice broke, and she paused, struggling to regain her composure. Arthur remained silent, allowing her to gather her strength. 3 weeks before we were due to leave, Daniel was diagnosed with leukemia. She continued, her eyes unfocused, reliving the devastating memory. Daniel underwent chemotherapy treatment, but it was too late. He died 6 months later. Arthur remained silent, the weight of her words settling between them, heavy and undeniable. "After that, I couldn't dance," she said, her voice filled with a profound sense of loss. "Every movement, every note of music was a painful reminder of what I had lost. The stage, once my sanctuary, became a symbol of my shattered dreams. I couldn't bear to face it." "So you became a nanny?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Mrs. Rodriguez let out a breath of amusement, though there was no real humor in it. "I needed a new beginning, a way to escape the ghosts of my past. I wanted to be useful, to make a difference in someone's life, even if it was in a small way." Arthur exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "And now you're teaching my daughter." He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You didn't hesitate?" Isabella's expression softened. "She needs this, and I believe I can provide it." Arthur stiffened, trying to process everything he had learned. Isabella had walked away from dance, yet for some reason she had chosen to share it with Lily. He had to understand why. You could have kept it to yourself, Arthur said slowly, his voice laced with a hint of suspicion. Why help her? She hesitated, her eyes searching his face. Because she reminds me of myself, she said softly. Arthur stiffened, taken aback by her candor. Because she doesn't smile, Mr. Blackwood. The words hit him like a physical blow, leaving him breathless and shaken. Arthur clenched his jaw, fighting back a wave of guilt. He couldn't deny the truth in her statement. Lily had been slowly fading away, retreating into a world of silence and solitude. He had been so focused on providing her with material security, so preoccupied with his own grief, that he had failed to recognize her silent suffering. She smiles when she dances, Mrs. Rodriguez added, her voice gentle but firm. And I think she just needed someone to listen, someone to believe in her. Arthur swallowed hard, turning away slightly to conceal his emotions. He had spent years ensuring that his daughter had everything she needed, except perhaps the one thing that mattered most, someone to nurture her spirit, to ignite her passion, to remind her how to smile. After a long moment of silence, he exhaled and asked, "What are you planning to do?" Mrs. Rodriguez tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "You mean, am I going to try to turn her into a professional dancer? To force her to relive my shattered dreams?" She shook her head, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "No, Mr. Blackwood. I just want her to find joy, to express herself, to connect with her emotions. The rest is up to her." Arthur sat with that for a long moment, absorbing everything she had said. He had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing everything that happened within the walls of his home. Yet somehow, he had been blind to the most important thing of all, his own daughter's happiness. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, tinged with a newfound humility. "I don't like people interfering in my family." Mrs. Rodriguez didn't flinch. "And I don't like seeing children who have forgotten how to be children." A thick silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Arthur had no response because, in the depths of his mind, he knew she was right. Lily stood before her father in the grand living room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the room, but the air crackled with tension. Arthur Blackwood sat in his usual chair, his expression unreadable as he watched his daughter shift nervously from foot to foot. Taking a deep breath, Lily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to enter the regional dance competition." The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur slowly placed his reading glasses on the table, his sharp gaze locking onto his daughter's face. "A dance competition?" he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. Lily nodded, standing a little straighter. "Yes, Dad, I want to compete." Arthur exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "And when did you decide this?" Lily hesitated, her eyes darting away for a moment. "A while ago. Mrs. Rodriguez has been helping me train, and she thinks I'm ready." Arthur's eyes flickered with something unreadable at the mention of Mrs. Rodriguez. "Does she?" His tone was carefully neutral, but Lily didn't miss the underlying skepticism. "Yes," Lily affirmed, her voice gaining strength. "And I believe I am too." Arthur looked at his daughter, truly looked at her, and saw something that hadn't been there before. A spark of passion, a glint of determination that went beyond mere childish enthusiasm. But it didn't erase the concerns that were twisting in his gut. "You realize this isn't a game, Lily," Arthur said, his voice firm. "Competitions aren't about fun and games. They're about discipline, pressure, and expectation. There will be disappointment." Lily straightened her back, her chin lifted slightly. "I know that, Dad, and I'm ready for that." Arthur stared at her for a long moment, weighing her words, assessing her resolve. Finally, he exhaled, the tension draining from his body. "Fine," he said, his voice softening slightly. "But if you're going to do this, you do it properly. No half measures, no excuses. You commit to it fully." Lily's face lit up with a grin, a smile so wide and genuine that it stunned Arthur for a moment. "Thank you, Dad." Later that evening, Arthur found Mrs. Rodriguez in the kitchen, carefully chopping vegetables with the precision of someone accustomed to structure and discipline. She glanced up as he entered, already sensing the reason for his visit. "You knew she would ask me," Arthur said, folding his arms across his chest. Mrs. Rodriguez paused, wiping her hands on a towel before turning to face him. "I suspected she might." "You think she's ready?" Arthur challenged, his eyes searching her face for any hint of doubt. Mrs. Rodriguez tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "She has the passion, the drive. The discipline will come with time." Arthur exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the counter. "If she does this, she will experience failure, rejection. She may not be able to handle that." Mrs. Rodriguez studied him for a long moment, her gaze penetrating. "Or maybe you're the one who isn't ready to handle it, Mr. Blackwood." Arthur's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he shifted the topic. "If we do this, we do it right. That means you will train her properly. No soft encouragements, no coddling. She needs to be pushed." Mrs. Rodriguez's lips curled slightly into a knowing smile. "I wasn't planning on going easy on her, Mr. Blackwood." The next morning, training officially began. Arthur watched from the sidelines as Mrs. Rodriguez transformed from the soft-spoken nanny into a strict, focused mentor. Lily moved through the exercises with surprising determination, her forehead beaded with sweat. Mrs. Rodriguez corrected her posture, her foot placements, and her rhythm, her voice firm but never harsh. "Again, Lily," she ordered. "You missed the beat. Focus." Lily wiped her brow and started over, her brow furrowed with concentration. Arthur, watching from the doorway, couldn't help but notice how much his daughter had changed in recent weeks. Before, she had been quiet and hesitant, always following rather than leading. Now there was a stubborn edge to her, a refusal to give up even when things didn't come easily. Hours passed, filled with drills, repetitions, and subtle corrections. When the session finally ended, Lily collapsed onto the floor, panting heavily. Mrs. Rodriguez handed her a bottle of water, which she took gratefully. "You did well today, Lily," she said simply, her eyes filled with pride. Lily grinned up at her, her face flushed with exertion. "That means a lot coming from you." Arthur remained silent, watching their interaction with an odd mixture of admiration and unease. It wasn't jealousy this time, but something deeper, something he couldn't quite define. He realized that Mrs. Rodriguez had given Lily something he hadn't been able to. A sense of confidence rooted in passion, a belief in her own abilities that transcended his material gifts. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to push away the unsettling thought. As the competition approached, training intensified. Lily pushed herself harder, working late into the evenings, repeating routines over and over. The initial playful excitement of dancing had now morphed into something else. A steely determination to excel. Arthur, despite his initial reservations, found himself drawn to every session, watching as his daughter evolved, both as a dancer and as a person. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Lily sat at the dining table, barely touching her food. Arthur noticed the way her leg bounced nervously beneath the table, her anxiety barely contained. "What's on your mind, Lily?" Arthur asked, his voice softer than usual. Lily hesitated, picking at her food with her fork. "There's another dancer in the competition," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Marcus Davies. He's won the regional competition for the past 2 years." Arthur nodded slowly, waiting for her to continue. Lily bit her lip, her eyes filled with apprehension. "He messaged me today, told me I don't stand a chance, that I'm wasting my time." Arthur's fingers tightened around his wine glass, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "And what do you think?" Lily hesitated, her gaze wavering. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice laced with uncertainty. Arthur leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. "Listen to me, Lily. People only try to break you down when they see you as a threat. If Marcus is going out of his way to intimidate you, it means he's already worried." Lily's eyes widened slightly, her posture shifting with a newfound confidence. "You really think so, Dad?" Arthur nodded, his voice firm. "I know so. Now go out there and prove him wrong." For the first time since the conversation started, Lily smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Then I guess I'll just have to." Arthur exhaled, watching his daughter with something akin to admiration. She wasn't the same little girl who had hidden behind books and routines. She was becoming something else, something stronger, something more resilient. For the first time in a long time, Arthur found himself genuinely looking forward to seeing what she would become. The theater was buzzing with nervous energy. Dancers warmed up in the backstage area, stretching, practicing footwork, and mentally rehearsing their routines. The sounds of music, hushed whispers, and the steady rhythm of nervous breathing filled the air. Lily stood among them, adjusting the ribbons on her ballet slippers, her hands slightly trembling. Arthur watched from a few feet away, his expression unreadable. He had always been a man who thrived on control, who meticulously planned every detail. But today, nothing was in his hands. His daughter was stepping onto that stage alone, and there was nothing he could do to influence the outcome. Mrs. Rodriguez stood beside Lily, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Breathe," she said simply, her voice calm and steady. Lily exhaled slowly, nodding. "I've done the work. The only thing left to do is dance." Arthur studied them from a distance, his heart swelling with a complex mixture of pride and longing. There was an unspoken bond between them, a shared understanding that made him feel like an outsider. Mrs. Rodriguez had given Lily something he hadn't been able to, a sense of self-belief, a confidence that came from within. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to suppress the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Now wasn't the time for reflection. It was time for Lily to shine. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Next, we welcome Lily Blackwood to the stage." Lily swallowed hard, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. She turned towards Arthur, searching for something: reassurance, approval, maybe even permission. Arthur gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Go," he said firmly, his voice barely audible above the din of the backstage noise. Lily took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The bright lights were blinding, the expectant silence of the audience pressing against her like a physical weight. She took her position at center stage, her heart pounding in her ears. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. What if she failed? What if she forgot the steps? What if Marcus had been right? What if she wasn't good enough? Then, she saw them in the front row. Her father sat watching with an intensity she had never witnessed before. There was no judgment in his expression, no expectation of perfection, just something steady, something real, something that made her feel safe and loved. Next to him, Mrs. Rodriguez gave her the smallest of nods, a silent gesture of encouragement that spoke volumes. The music began, a soaring melody that filled the theater. Lily closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let go. Her body moved before her mind could second-guess it, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next. The stage became her world, the pressure melting away. She wasn't here to win, she was here to dance. The final sequence was the most difficult, a complex series of turns and leaps that she had struggled with for weeks. She braced herself, pushed off the floor, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow to a standstill. She felt weightless, suspended in midair, the music carrying her through the air. Then she landed, light on her feet, steady and strong. The music swelled to a crescendo, then faded to silence. A beat of expectant quiet, then the applause erupted, a thunderous wave of sound that washed over her. Lily stood there, her chest rising and falling, her skin damp with sweat. She scanned the crowd, searching for the faces that mattered most. Her father was on his feet, clapping enthusiastically, his eyes shining with pride. Mrs. Rodriguez was clapping too, her face beaming with joy. The results were announced soon after. "And the winner of this year's regional dance competition is Marcus Davies." The audience cheered as Marcus stepped forward to accept his trophy, his confident smirk never wavering. Lily swallowed hard, trying to keep her expression neutral. She had lost. All those hours of training, all the sacrifices, all the pressure, it had all been for nothing. But before she could fully process her disappointment, the announcer continued. "We would also like to present a special award tonight. An award that recognizes not just technical skill, but artistry, passion, and heart. The Artistic Expression Award goes to Lily Blackwood." A collective gasp rippled through the audience, followed by another burst of applause. Lily blinked in surprise as her name echoed through the theater. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest, and accepted the medal that was placed around her neck. It wasn't the first-place trophy, but as she turned towards the audience, her father's expression told her everything she needed to know. This was more than just a consolation prize. It was a validation of her journey, a recognition of her spirit. Later, as she removed her dance shoes in the dressing room, Marcus approached her, his smug demeanor slightly diminished. "Not bad," he conceded, twirling his trophy in his hands. "You might actually be decent next year." Lily smiled slightly, a newfound confidence radiating from within her. "Next year, I'm winning," Marcus smirked. "We'll see about that." Outside the theater, Arthur and Mrs. Rodriguez waited patiently. When Lily finally emerged, Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "How do you feel, Lily?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine curiosity. Lily paused for a moment, considering the question. Then she answered, "Proud, Dad. Really proud." Arthur nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and love. "Good." As they walked towards the car, Lily glanced down at the medal in her hand. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about pushing herself beyond her limits, about finding her voice, about discovering the joy and the strength that lay within. It was about proving to herself that she belonged on that stage, that she was capable of anything she set her mind to. Lily looked up at her father, a question in her eyes. "Can I keep training, Dad?" Arthur smiled, a rare and genuine smile that lit up his face. "Of course, Lily," he said, his voice warm and sincere. "We're just getting started." Arthur never expected that a single moment, a seemingly insignificant glimpse through a window, could change everything. But that day, he learned that true success wasn't measured in wealth or power, but in the connections he forged, in the passions he ignited, and in the love he shared with his daughter. From now on, nothing would ever be the same again. What hidden talents are waiting to be discovered within your own life or the lives of those around you? How can you embrace the unexpected and allow it to enrich your journey? Are you ready to listen to the unspoken symphonies that surround you, waiting to be heard? I hope this story has inspired you to look beyond the surface and appreciate the beauty of human connection. Remember, the most meaningful moments often arise from the most unexpected places. May good health and happiness always be with you. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring content. Your support means the world to me.